Excited to have everybody here and excited for this whole conference. Just to put this session into context of what we're planning to do, this conference is built out of this idea that Green Tech Media came up with called the grid edge. And it was fundamentally around the notion that there's some kind of fundamental, I'll reuse the word, transformation occurring in the electricity sector at the edge of the grid where the utility meets the customer, both from a physical perspective and a conceptual perspective. So the whole program that we built here at the conference and our research and the Executive Council and when we cover the grid edge online is based upon this notion that there is something fundamentally different going on and that the market is going to be transformed over the course of the next decade, 2 decades, whatever it may be. But and I think we sold out the conference, so all of you must agree with us. But before we dive down into the details of what that transformation means and the ways in which it might occur and the technologies that will enable it and the business models that will catalyze it, we wanted to have a sort of 30,000-foot view session at the beginning here with some luminaries in the industry who can help us walk through some thinking around, is there really something transformative going on? And what does it mean? What does it mean for utilities? What does it mean for technology vendors? Who's going to be left standing at the end of it? How long should we be talking about in terms of this time frame for it occurring? And so this session is just setting the stage for what will be a variety of detailed conversations that will take place in the rest of the conference. But for now, we're going to focus on the big picture and see what we think is going to happen in electricity in the US and to some extent internationally as well. So with that, I have 3 really fantastic panelists for this session, coming from 3 very different perspectives, all of which are important and valid in this context. Beginning at the far end here, I have Paul Martini, who's the Managing Director of the Newport Consulting Group, also a former executive at Southern California Edison and Cisco as well, so he gets to play both the sort of technology exec role and from inside the utility, but he's outside the utility now, so he can actually say what he thinks. Dan Yates is the CEO of Opower. I'm sure all of you know Opower, but it's now a publicly traded company, one of the big clean tech success stories over the past decade in the US, and has really built a fantastic business off of working with utilities around new business models for them and ways to engage with customers in ways that they hadn't before. And then finally, we're really excited to have Mark Ferron here as well. Mark Ferron is a former commissioner at the California Public Utilities Commission. Many of you may have seen, Mark, I think you've become more famous since you left the CPUC than you were at the CPUC, but retired from the CPUC and, wrote sort of bluntly about what it's like, what's changing right now, and the pressures that regulators are under in a world that is changing. So, fantastic panel with me. I want to start with Mark. Oh, but I'm sorry, this is a fireside chat, in case anyone doesn't. So, put on your robes, get your brandy.
I left my brandy in my room.
Nothing says the future like Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a fireside chat.
That's right. Yeah. I feel all warm and cuddly. So, Mark, do you think that there is something fundamentally transformative occurring in electricity in the US right now? And if so, how would you characterize it briefly?
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to San Diego. I think there's absolutely a transformation taking place. And I think it's one which has been building for some time, but I think many of the elements are coming together to cause an acceleration. In a sense, I think we're moving from an evolutionary stage where things we're moving along relatively slowly to one where we're going to reach a series of tipping points, and I think we'll see an acceleration, perhaps even a revolution in the way electricity is produced, and the way it's consumed, and the way that consumers look at it. I think the days of the centralized generation and transmission and distribution model has already been eroded in a number of areas, and I think technology and new competition are going to and together with new regulatory regimes, I think are going to really accelerate that.
Do you think that, I mean, you mentioned a series of tipping points, and I imagine that you have some risk in the electricity sector in particular, because it's so heavily regulated, that you start to hit a tipping point. It looks like you're hitting a tipping point, and regulators put the brakes on it because you can't have change that fast and not deal with all the issues like equitability and maintaining low rates and things like that.
Right, right. Well, that is, I think, a top concern for regulators. I mean, you know, when I was at the PUC, I remember having conversations with Governor Brown, and you know, as everyone knows, he's been a supporter of renewable energy since the 1970s. But I remember him saying to me, "Make sure you don't screw it up." You know, so and California has a history of having screwed things up in the beginning of the century, and it had direct political ramifications. So regulators, you know, are inherently cautious, and you know, are going to want to make sure that there aren't unanticipated consequences. But I think the reality is that Moore's law is going to move faster than regulators can move, and so it's really important for regulators to be thinking in advance of the curve. You know, how do you respond to changes, and to try to create an environment which embraces it. I mean, I think you can take two approaches. You can put your head in the sand and hope these changes go away, or a version of that which is to try to slow things down and preserve the status quo, or you can try to embrace the change and try to ensure that you create the right kind of incentives to, you know, to create competition, to create high quality products for customers. And I'd like to think that you know, increasingly regulators will turn to the second approach and try to anticipate the curve.
Right. Okay, Dan, let's move on to you. I'll ask you the question in maybe a slightly different way, which is, do you view what Opower is doing and the ways in which you are working with utilities as evolutionary or revolutionary? And what does that mean for the broader context of electricity in general?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the way I would cast it as, in a lot of ways, the revolutionary version of our future is the part of the market that's driven by new entrants. So distributed solar companies that have historically not been, you know, energy providers, and the evolutionary part is how the grid, the historical utilities, the ones who run the grid, the ones who run the generation, how they adapt. So we are clearly the most, you know, the largest, most innovative company on the evolutionary side of the equation, and we have no uncertainty around that. We're not dabbling in trying to work against our utility partners. But I think that then the question becomes, so what does the future look like? Does it look like a revolution where our customers, the utilities, are totally disruptive and fade away, and Solar City is the next great, you know, utility? Or does it look like some hybrid, or does it look like a situation where ultimately it's just all back to the status quo? I think it's very clear that it's not status quo. We have significant disruptive forces coming that have real value to consumers, that there's popular momentum. I was just hearing Warren Buffett talk at EEI in Vegas a few weeks ago, and he said, look, the public opinion is in. People like solar. Don't fight that. That's done. So now you have to say, okay, what do I do with that fact?
Right.
And I think that when you look at the opportunities for utilities, there are two divergent futures. One is the analogy to, you know, telecom, where the old, you know, the pots fade away and it's just all now Verizon and wireless. But there's some problems with that analogy. There's something truly differentiated and better about phone service on a cell phone versus phone service in your landline, and electricity is electricity.
You also pay more now for your
That's
phone
right.
than you did then, and I don't think anybody's interested in paying more for electricity.
That's right. So there's a second analogy, which I think is actually the more appropriate one, which is retail banking. So over the last 30 years, retail banks were attacked by credit card companies. Now there are successful credit card companies like Capital One that have become retail banks, but they adapted. And they adapted because they pivoted around the customer. When I was a kid, I went to the bank to do everything. I had to deposit checks there. I didn't have a bank account as a kid, but I went with my mom. She deposited checks, she withdrew money, et cetera. Now I bank with USAA. They don't even have a branch in my state. I do everything on the phone. And banks pivoted to become much more customer oriented. And I think to Commissioner Ferron's point, or former Commissioner Ferron's point, utilities have to pivot towards the customer so that they can create some customer pull so that their commissions believe that they're a credible actor in this transformation. If they don't pivot towards the customer and there's no customer pull, they're not bringing an A game in terms of delivering the end outcome to the user, then why should they be in this?
Right.
And I think depending on how utilities act, that will determine which way these things evolve.
That's a great segue actually into Paul putting on your utility executive hat. I mean, did you have the sense at SCE or just in general now for utilities when you're consulting that they take that same view, that they need to pivot toward being more customer oriented or perish? And I also think, to comment on Dan's point about them being viewed as credible actors by regulators, I think that's a really interesting point as well. Like, is that something that they're thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely they are. Increasingly, I think there's this recognition coming out of some of the initial discussions, debate around net energy metering last year. I think there was this recognition that, to the point about what Warren Buffett said, that there really is this need to focus on customer, which they have been increasingly, but also this recognition that they have to be enablers of public policy in the sense of for example, with solar and some of these other distributed technologies that are increasingly part of public policy mandates or targets that are out there, that there's this recognition that they need to be enabling that and facilitator. And so then the question is, well, what does that really mean? Certainly there's elements that tie back to the customer piece, which is, can you leverage this customer relationship? I mean, we can't forget that many of these large utilities, like at Southern Cal Edison, they serve a 14 million person population, and they interact at all levels, many levels in the community, and both in terms of what they provide from a utility service with much of that population. That's potentially a sales and marketing channel that could be leveraged by any number of firms in terms of services that could be offered. So how best to take advantage of that, both in terms of enabling public policy, not just in terms of getting out particular technologies, but also how best to maybe serve parts of the market that may not otherwise be served by the competitive market, that may go to a different demographic that is the traditional target. How might the utility be a channel into some of these other segments? So that's being talked about. I think the other is looking at, from an investment standpoint, what do we need to think about in terms of the infrastructure to enable this future? Certainly a conversation in New York, this whole discussion around the distribution service platform provider concept. So what is the platform? That's part of the conversation in California on the implementation of a provision. One of the sections within law that got passed, AB 327, is focused on distribution planning and these questions about what does the investment in distribution need to look like to enable this future, more distributed future. So yes, it's very much on people's minds. I will say that it's uneven in terms of the intensity of the discussion around the U.S. in terms of how far people are thinking through this. I mean, certainly New York and California and Hawaii are probably at the forefront, but there are a number of other states right behind that are thinking through these issues, the question of value of solar and so on, which are related to then what do you need to think about from an investment standpoint, what can be provided by third party or customer technology in terms of services back to avoid capital or deferred capital investment. So yes, these conversations are beginning, and I think we're at a really interesting point leading up to where I think we're going to see these inflections over the between now and 5 years in many of the states.
Right. Yeah, I want to tie one thing that you mentioned there back to a couple other things, which was you talked a little bit about, you mentioned for a moment AB 327, which is the bill in California that created the net metering compromise and also had a bunch of other things in it. And I'll turn to Mark here because you wrote something that was just great writing, but also I'm sure has been thrown back at you a bunch of times since then, which is you called that compromise a poisoned chalice. Mm-hmm. And you said that because of the pressures the regulators are now going to be under to, I guess, to make changes to it and to increase the fixed charges and things like that, that, you know, it's a dangerous precedent to set. I guess the question for you is, you know, regulators are central actors in any of these big changes that we're talking about. But as you pointed out, are under an enormous amount of pressure from the industry and from various interest groups. How does anything big get done? And if it doesn't get done, then, you know, are we facing a really significant concern when it comes to reliability or prices for customers that can't, you know, install their own generation?
Well, let me start by saying I'm absolutely delighted that AB 327 passed in the form that it did, because what it did was it instead of having the issue of rate design and net energy metering and a number of other technical issues be decided by the California State Legislature, it was 100% kicked over to the PUC. So that is unequivocally great news, because as wonderful as the state legislature is, they are not experts in the energy industry, although many of them think that they are. And what comes out of that process is oftentimes very intransparent. So at least at the PUC, you're dealing with people who think about these issues on a daily basis, and there's a process that has at least a prospect of being transparent. You know, to me, the issue really is, this is in a sense, the battleground which will define perhaps, at least in the short term, the pace of change that happens in California. And you know, the issue really, I guess what I was saying to my fellow regulators, my fellow former colleagues, was you know, the regulatory process is very much an adjudicatory one, where the evidence is presented by, you know, various parties in an attempt to weigh up a balanced decision. And this may be an instance where, you know, the evidence you can just see will come out to permit a whole spectrum of different outcomes. And I mentioned this elsewhere as the fallacy of the middle ground. I mean, there are times where if you have, let's say, two opposite positions, to strike a balance directly in the middle is actually not the best outcome. It's to consider those two sides and decide which one best fits what's going forward. So my concern would be that we craft together some kind of, you know, hybrid animal that satisfies a number of constituents, and it doesn't really hang together. But I do have a tremendous amount of faith in the staff of the PUC and in my fellow commissioners to try to do what is right. I mean, I think one of the issues that absolutely permeates all policy discussions in California, and I think we're somewhat unusual in that regard, is our energy policy is set on the basis of hitting greenhouse gas reduction targets. And we're on path to do that for 2020, but the path gets much, much steeper between 2020 and 2050, roughly, you know, 4 to 1. And so the amount of changes that we're going to need to see in terms of decarbonization and moving you know, to the electrification of the fleet are going to have to be much more pronounced if you think beyond 2020. And we're, you know, beginning to work through what the ramifications of this are now. So I think it is time, you know, for folks in California to continue to push hard to look forward in terms of setting policy priorities, because we're just beginning now to see the impact of climate change. And I think you know, the most striking thing about Stephen's book and about what's happened on the East Coast is, you know, you guys have had, folks on the East Coast have had direct experience of what happens with climate change. I think now that hopefully will generate some additional momentum on the other side of the country towards what I think needs to happen in the electricity sector.
Right, and we appreciate the plug for the ebook. That's kind of you. Dan, so that, you know, I think California is pretty forward-looking in almost every regard when it comes to energy, and it's great to look at California and what's happening there as a sort of foreshadowing other places. But you know, you're working already with 100+ utilities all over the place. I mean, can you speak outside California's borders? What is the sense that you're getting broadly from utilities that you're working with, and sort of, in terms of the pivot that they're making towards being more customer-oriented, where do you see opportunities there?
Yeah, I'd say the wave has broken in the last 18 months. We are having conversations today with utilities in a dozen states about stuff that we don't even do yet, about helping to, stuff that they don't do yet around solar, about helping them make this transition to the next phase of their business model, which has to be, and the next phase of the solar industry has to have a degree of utility complicitness and involvement and some degree of profit for the utility. The alternate universe is that we actually, as you guys identified, I think low likelihood, decouple every single customer from the grid and there's no more grid. We've spent trillions of dollars building this grid. That is it's lunacy for us to do that. It's just, there's a much, much cheaper way. Even if you say, I'm going to get rid of the transmission lines and we'll do it all at a district level, at least you should have regional storage, regional solar generation. And the utility should be in the business of, I don't want to run my own electric system in my house. I want to pay somebody to do it. So everybody's, I think we see, whether it's in the Midwest or the South or the Northeast or the West, we see utilities who've woken up and they have teams working specifically on these problems. Now, I think the biggest challenge to the utility industry today is that utilities love their grid. And they have a right to, because it's the most complicated machine that man has ever built. And they're incredibly proud of that. And now they've added smart meters to that grid, and it's even more complicated, and they're further instrumenting. And the risk is that utilities remain so enamored and inwardly focused on operational efficiencies with the grid. And you see this right now. There's this huge surge across our industry with a focus on analytics. And there's absolutely no question that there's unbelievable power to be taken from analytics from these smart meter devices. But I go every day and talk to utility executives who have spent millions of dollars on a BI system, on an analytics system, and they have not seen a single result in terms of reduction in call volume, customer satisfaction, because they're not facing outward to the customer, and they're not reorienting their business to be not more customer friendly, but more customer relevant. And if they don't do that, that's the risk. You can squeeze 10% more cost efficiencies out of your system and out of your operations over the next decade, and at the same time wake up and see you've lost 25% of your customers. And when we talk to utilities part of why we're engaged around these conversations around solar is the business cases are nuts. I mean, we were working here at St. Gas and Electric. I was meeting with Carolyn Wynn and Ted Regularly, and we were just running some numbers looking at what would happen if SDGE was in the business of just doing 10,000 solar installations a year, because they're losing about 25,000 customers a year. And let's say only half of those customers that they actually increased by 5,000 customers, the number of people who buy solar, and so they only took away 5,000 from outsiders. In 3 years, that would have $1 billion net present value to their business. You can't have a rate case like that around analytics and grid optimization, or business case. So that's the risk. And what's given me hope and enthusiasm is that so many of our customers, whether it's AEP Ohio, who is not known as being in states that are particularly progressive, or National Grid in the Northeast that is absolutely in some of the hotbeds like New York and Massachusetts, they're all looking at this. So I feel confident that phase 2 is utility involvement in this process. Is it going to be mostly community solar, where you buy solar shares that starts with apartment buildings, or is it going to actually be rooftop distributed generation, or is it going to be primarily power utilities? I don't know. I think it's going to vary. Right. But I think you're going to see all of the above.
I think so. We have a tendency, certainly within Green Tech Media, partially because we have such a big, mature solar practice in our business, but also just generally, I think when we have conversations around grid edge with people in the industry, we have a tendency to myopically focus in on solar, and certainly it makes some sense because distributed solar is what's proliferating now and causing the most pain, and there's the most battles around it in regulatory venues and legislative venues as well sometimes. But grid edge is about more than that, and there are other sort of customer-sided technologies that are worth mentioning, and certainly we're going to be covering at this conference. So maybe we can start with you, Paul, and then I want to go around and have everybody answer this. What technology other than solar do you view as most likely to have a transformative impact over the next decade, let's say?
Well, the one that actually even in yesterday's discussion that didn't come up much, and although we recognize reliability as a very big issue for customers, and next to price, reliability is the next thing before environmental benefits in most surveys that are done on customers. And if you look, it's not so much of an issue in the western U.S., but if you look at reliability on anywhere east of the Mississippi, you're really talking about backup generation, and the growth in the domestic sort of residential small commercial space on backup generation has been unbelievable. I mean, it's about 45% on average for the last 3 years, year over year. If you look at the sales results out of Generac, which has about 70% of the market share, and these are not cheap. So I'll come back to one of the things you said, which I'll sort of disagree with. People are willing to pay more for electricity because when you factor in a $6,000 backup generator and what that cost is for financing that, you're essentially doubling your utility bill in places like Pittsburgh, where people are adopting. So people are willing to pay, not everybody, but a fair number are thinking about it. So the question is, what's the implication from a utility standpoint that's thinking about, well, or even a regulatory standpoint that says, I have a minimum standard for reliability and that's what we build to, but yet a whole set of customers are increasingly taking on their own to address this. One of the things we talked about yesterday in the context of grid defection is that you would need to have some form of backup generation, and people sort of dismiss that. Well, guess what? There's this whole installed base that's going out there right now. They may not have the solar, they may not have the storage yet, but some of the building blocks are already going to be there. So I do think that this is an area that really needs to be explored, and a number of utilities are actually, like Madison Gas and Electric, are actually on that side of it, getting into the business of, and have regulatory approval through the regulated side to be in the business of essentially install and maintain. And Portland General Electric has a program where they're actually installing equipment to be able to leverage that technology to be able to mitigate peak demand and so on.
So this is for
I think we're
backup
going to
generation,
see,
though, MG&Es. Okay, so it's actually reminding me of something I read maybe a week or two ago, which was somebody putting an idea out there that utilities ultimately have tiered pricing based on reliability. So if you want, 1.9 versus 6.9s, you pay different rates. Does that seem realistic to you? Is there any argument for that?
I think there is. I mean, people are exploring. I think what you're seeing also that I think is going to help create the tipping point is this. We've gotten past the discussion of should there be unbundling of the retail rates into the components that make up the service. It seems like in many of the states we're starting to have that conversation, both in terms of what distributed energy resource providers can provide to the utility, which means you have to unbundle some of it, but also what the utility may need to charge, moving beyond sort of the fixed charges and so on, the discussion into what are the set of services that maybe somebody that has storage and solar, what are the services that they buy? Because they may not need to buy all the others. They may be able to avoid some. But also in that discussion is what are the ranges of reliability do they want, and how might the utility provide that, both from justifying what might be needed in terms of a microgrid if you have a community that's interested in it, so you're going to have some way of paying something extra if there's enhanced reliability desired, or perhaps providing those services behind the meter in terms of augmenting, like what Madison Gas and Electric is doing with respect to individual backup generation.
Huh. So now that I'm going to put two questions to you then, Mark, because now I'm interested. So one was the first question.
Be careful, I can only hold two things in my head at once.
So I can't.
That's one more than me.
Okay, so number one of the two things that you'll hold is name a technology other than solar that you think is going to have the most transformative impact in the next decade. And then number two, I'll put it out there now, and then I can remind you in a bit, is do you also view it as sort of the way that we're heading ultimately, where you're going to have tiered pricing from utilities based on reliability?
Okay. Well, let me take the second one first. In fact, let me take the third one first, and say one of the things. As Paul's talking about, distributed generation in the form of backup generators. I presume much of that is diesel powered.
Gas-fired, actually.
Or gas-fired. Okay. But even so, that's very alarming to me, because these are typically not going to be terribly efficient machines from an emissions standpoint. So that's a big concern. That we. As customers are naturally pursuing high quality electricity and concerned about reliability, we could wind up shooting ourselves in the foot from an emissions standpoint. So I'm concerned about that. In terms of the tiering of pricing, it makes sense. You want to respond to what customers want to have, and if some are willing to pay for a differentiated service, then that does make sense. I do worry from a public policy standpoint about what that does to the baseline tier.
Yeah.
I mean, the analogy there is the airline industry. I mean, a number of you would have flown down here, and the quality of economy travel is not what it was 10 or 20 years ago. Now the costs are dramatically lower as well. But I would be concerned about in this pursuit of higher differentiation, presumably higher profit margin, that the baseline tier would deteriorate. And electricity is such a vital component to modern life. I would be worried about those who are in the bottom tier. And I do remember the first question, which was about technology. I'm not into the guts of the technology, but I'm very excited about the combination of big data and smart meters coupled with some of the automation technologies which are already in place in commercial buildings and which are increasingly going to come to the retail side. I think there's tremendous potential for using that capability together with data to really almost invisibly to the customer create a variety of load profiles to help to shape as we bring on more renewables. So this infinite duck curve, I think there are elements of technology which are already out there, will be deployed in the next few years, which will very much help to shape that.
Great. Okay, Dan, two questions to you as well. One, the same question, what technology other than solar you think will have the most transformative impact? And the second is just building off of the big data piece of this. Opower is, I guess, arguably in part, if not in whole, a data company or a big data company. What is the coolest thing you could potentially do with big data for energy in the next decade? I mean, what's not being done now that if you think ahead would be really exciting?
Yeah, so I feel like this is great. That's one question in my mind. So I was just going to build off of what Mark was saying. I think the word automation is the word I was going to use. I think it is absolutely the next. It's what's the big opportunity. So if you look, and I'm an enterprise software guy. This is my second enterprise software company. I work with a lot of we're venture funded. Work with a lot of venture capitalists, including we had a huge month this month. Travis Sallow, who is one of our longtime board observers from Kleiner Perkins, has now seen an Opower IPO, a Nest acquisition, and a Dropcam acquisition. So there's clearly good motion within Kleiner Perkins and within this universe. Things are happening. But I talk to all these folks, and I see lots of industries. And in enterprise software, there's always these three phases of development. You have first what I think of as process software. And this is where most enterprise software is. It's digitizing workflows and collecting data. This is in the utility industry. It's your customer information system. It's your distribution management system, your energy management system. Then the second phase is analytics. It's like, okay, hey, I got all this data on my customers. What is the source of all my calls? Oh, it's high bill calls. Okay, I ran some analytics and figured that out. And then the third phase is automation. And that is, I've got the data collected, I've analyzed it, and now I'm going to actually just have my software, my systems take action. And the thing is, when you introduce a new data source, you hit a reset. So we've introduced this new big data source, which is smart meters, and you see the same process happening. So what's the first phase? Meter data management systems, cleaning up all the process software so that you can collect the data. Then you go to analytics, and now we are going to automation. I think you're going to see this across the grid, whether it's on the distribution side with some of these new capabilities to actually, to instrument the grid beyond the SCADA systems where they've been historically getting out deep into distribution networks. It's also on the customer side. And with analytics, you can't do anything on the customer side. You need automation because you run a list and show all the customers who have high bills. You can't roll a truck with a dude to go say sorry to everybody. You got to have some system that automatically takes the next step. And so then that leads to here's as Opower envisions, and this I think comes back to your even further previous question, which is what is the technology that's the big moves in the next 10 years, I think we know already, right? It's the stuff that was, that you guys surveyed. It's around distributed generation. It's around smart grid. I don't think we're going to have some spontaneous, disruptive new technology that we've never even heard of. We kind of know what the battleground is for the next 10 years. So in that context, where Opower's vision is that we want to help our utility partners improve and transform every single customer touch point by bringing another level of automation. So an example is we run analytics and to determine that you're on track for a high bill, higher than normal for you. We email you or call you based upon your preferences. And it says, hey, you got a high bill. Here's some targeted recommendations. We know you took this action before. Do this, et cetera. You don't take any action. You still get a high bill. Your bill comes in the mail. We still know you had a high bill. The bill should say, hey, John, you had a high bill. We're here to help. Here's how we can recommend. Customer still, furious calls the call center. The call center automation tree should know, hey, you had a high bill. Here's how we can help, et cetera, et cetera. And this leads to lower cost to serve, better customer satisfaction, and puts the utility in a position that every single time you have one of those touch points, if the utility has won the regulatory, conversation around solar, you can say, hey, we've got a combined solar and energy efficiency solution we can bring you to give you clean energy at the same price.
Right.
And this is, this is where we see this moving, and I think, the word is automation.
That's interesting. And you touched on a couple times something that I'll note we're going to talk about later in the conference a number of times, which is the possibility of utilities installing or owning and operating, or both, solar in particular, because that's a big question mark, I think, as well. But we have a little under 10 minutes left. So what I want to do to close out is have each of you paint a picture for me. So imagine that we're in 2024, and so it's 10 years from now, and I'm an electricity customer. I'm just an average ratepayer. Who am I buying from, and what am I signing up for? What is different from my current interaction with my utility? Part of it may be this is what happens if I have a high bill in any given month. But in general, what are the options that are available to me, and how is that different from today? And then we're going to write all this down, and at Grid Edge Live 2024, we're going to come back and see if you guys were right. But so briefly, what does it look like for a customer in 10 years?
Well, I think there's two things that we're talking about here, and Dan just touched on a couple of them. First of all, I think it's a highly personalized service. So it's not this class average kind of minimum standard service that we've kind of lived with for some time. I think there's a lot of customization. I think the pricing that you get is very differentiated to your particular situation. So it's not, again, sort of one size fits all. So I think it's very highly personalized, and I do think it's highly automated. So not just automated in terms of, as Dan's talking about, but as we roll this out 10 years, the amount of automation that's linked to what Dan talked about, to actual physical action in terms of control or operation of physical systems, whether it's on the grid side or interacting with your devices, is to achieve these outcomes that you desire in terms of managing your bill, are going to be automated as well. We've talked about these set and forget ideas for some time. I think we're starting to see that come into play, and I think it's really going to come much more to the forefront as we start to converge the kind of information that's available, both the customer information, the billing information, and the operational information that is coming out of the grid and starting to be available a little bit more publicly than it has in the past, to bring this to bear in terms of this personalization and managing both helping the customer manage their side of it, as well as on the upstream in terms of the electric system, in terms of optimizing that as well. So I think we're going to see all that come to play in this highly personalized service.
Great. All right, personalization is the buzzword there. Mark, what does it look like for me in 10 years?
That's a good question. I can kind of see a blend of a fixed cost. So I can see a world where essentially you as a customer do a contract with a provider, and in which you agree that you're going to be consuming a certain pattern of electricity, and they work with you to ensure that you hit that target on the bill. And to the extent that you exceed that target for reasons, there may be very high marginal cost to that, but there'll be a high degree of predictability in the bill. And I think that is all kind of what the consumer sees, which will be, I need to think once a year about what my electricity use is going to be, and then once a month there's a true up, and I want to try to stay on that unless there are good circumstances for not doing so. That's what the customer sees. Now, below the surface, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of activity, and I think this is where the automation comes in, because there will be value as you think about penetration of EVs and other appliances that become smart and can communicate through the smart meter, whereby I may get paid for allowing my electric car to be charged at different times during the course of the day, or not necessarily cycle on and off, but not necessarily discharge to the grid, but cycling on and off during the course of the day. And if I get paid for that, allowing that to happen, and it's all part of the way of my bill being that much lower, I'll sign up for that tomorrow. And I think that will become more and more common. They'll become ubiquitous on large appliances, as we're starting to see in the commercial space.
Great. All right.
I don't know how you summarize that. I think we'll see.
I don't have a buzzword.
Well, I think the
for
buzzword
that
will be
one.
we'll see bill simplicity, but a high degree of complexity behind the scenes and kind of invisible demand response and energy efficiency going on.
Right. That buzzword turned into a buzz phrase.
I know. I can't help myself.
Okay. Dan, close this out here. So what does it look like for me, the customer, in a decade?
Well, obviously you have Opower.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll pick the middle class customer because I think the rich customer is going to be a wide, I mean, and to Paul's point, it's going to be a varied level of service, and for the rich customer, it's going to be whatever their preference is. If they're obsessed with reliability, they'll buy their own grid storage. They may decouple if they hate their utility for some emotional reason. They, who knows what. They'll have all the bells and whistles. But so, to me, it's like, what's the fat part of the curve? What does that look like? And I think, I see a world where you do have the feature sets that I just described, where no one's surprised by a high bill, where you have great self-service, where you don't have to call the call center and wait online, whether to connect or disconnect, or to address issues with your bill. And then I picture the middle class customer who has participated in a utility run program akin to what Massachusetts does with Mass Saves, where right now they do whole home audits paid for on the backs of the fact that they can do heating oil conversion from heating oil to natural gas, and so it funds the whole in-home visit, and then you get a thermostat. But instead, you do the same thing with solar. So middle-class customer can't afford a full solar installation, but they get, as part of the utility program, they've gotten an energy efficiency upgrade. They have a low-cost Wi-Fi thermostat that is connected to a rewards program where they get incentivized to reduce their usage automatically on peak days. And they've gotten a panel as part of the deal. Where's the panel? It's on a solar farm in the community. It's got their name at the bottom. They can go with the kids to visit the panel. They can be proud of that. I'm serious. I'm serious. Because they bought solar, they didn't have enough money to put it on their roof, and it wasn't worth it. But they got it as part of this program. They got 1 or 2 panels, and then they have half of their energy therefore is clean. Their bill hasn't gone up. They've got efficient light bulbs, et cetera. And they've got, with their thermostat, because the utility knows the balance of their usage and they're on one of these new rates, the thermostat is actually set to $110 instead of to 78 degrees, and it automatically carries them through. And so everything throughout is cleaner and automated. The bill is easier, the experience is easier, it's tied in with these nice strategic touch points to bring the customer to a different level of service. The utility is now delivering comfort and clean energy, not just a commodity price. They've got a role to play in this whole picture. We haven't thrown out the multi-trillion-dollar investment in the grid. You notice I didn't mention storage. I don't think that it's going to be a huge thing in 10 years. I think maybe in 20. I think that's where things are heading.
Sounds like a great future. It sounds also like that's probably something that you've said to your utility partners before, I suspect. Right? I mean, because it paints a really good picture for utilities.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
But
I mean, it makes them sound like they've turned the corner and now everybody loves them. They're providing comfort.
That's
and,
right.
You know.
And the future is, of course, heterogeneous, right? There will be parts of this country where the utilities don't get ahead of the ball and the commission gets fed up waiting and they get terribly disrupted and it looks like Germany. There will be other parts of this country in 10 years where solar is still, no one knows how to spell the word. So there'll be, and it's a very hard word to spell. So, I think there'll be a wide range, but that's where I see things heading overall.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great way for us to end and on time. So please join me in thanking our Fireside Chat panelists. And now I'm going to hand it back to Rick to introduce our keynote speaker, which is the last session before a break this morning.
All right, do you have the clicker?